An overwhelming call at the United Nations for a ceasefire in Gaza. Israel and the US among the few voting against the resolution. How isolated are both nations from most of the world which opposes the war? Can international opposition have any impact? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. The Hamas killing of 1,147 people in southern Israel on October the 7th caused global outrage. Since then, though, 15 times as many Palestinians, mostly women and children, have been killed in a merciless bombing campaign by one of the world's most powerful militaries, backed by the US and Western allies. These countries proclaim support for human rights and international law, both of which Israel tramples on daily in Gaza and the occupied West Bank. So how is Western support for Israel viewed elsewhere? Could the Gaza war change the current world order? Is support for Israel damaging the West? We'll be asking these questions and more of our guests in just a few moments. But first, this report from Cara Legg on how Israel and the US have found themselves in a minority of world opinion.
Months of bombing and a worsening humanitarian crisis. Despite growing calls for a halt to Israel's war on Gaza, the world's most powerful body, the United Nations Security Council, has failed to put a stop to Israel's violence, with the US wielding its veto power, standing alone in blocking resolutions for a ceasefire. But the demands have not stopped, moving to the UN General Assembly.
I used my recent attendance at the Doha Forum and every other platform I can to encourage cooperation among states with the same singular goal in mind: to make peace for all. In the name of humanity, I ask you all once again, stop this violence now.
The Assembly spoke loud and clear, an overwhelming vote in favour of a resolution seeking a humanitarian ceasefire and the release of all captives from Gaza. 153 member states supported it, 21 more than the last time the Assembly called for a humanitarian truce. War-torn Ukraine was among the few countries to abstain, refusing to call for a halt to a war backed by its Western allies. The US and Israel, however, voted against the resolution.
We support speaking out with one voice to condemn Hamas for its terrorist actions on October 7th. Why is that so hard? To say unequivocally that murdering babies and gunning down parents in front of their children is horrific.
The exploitation of the Palestinians has made the UN a moral stain on humanity. Why are you continuing to allow them to make the United Nations irrelevant?
The resolution is non-binding, but it carries political weight and reflects a global perspective of the war. The Arab and Islamic countries who spearheaded the effort have pledged to use this as momentum to keep pushing for a ceasefire. The Palestinian Authority has welcomed the resolution and urged countries to pressure Israel to adopt the ceasefire. As ground battles intensify in northern Gaza, Israel has carried out some of the heaviest bombing in days in the south. The UN vote indicates Israel's growing diplomatic isolation. US President Joe Biden has warned it risks losing international support because of its, quote, indiscriminate bombing. Even close ally Australia backed the UN resolution in a rare split with the US. And while the world waits to see if the UN Security Council will hold another vote, people on the streets, far from the corridors of Western power, are making their voices heard. Cara Legg, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
So let's bring in our guests for today's discussion. From Paris, we're joined by Temir Porras, a former career diplomat in Venezuela and a policy advisor specialising in Latin American economics and geopolitics. From Cape Town, South Africa, we're joined by Melanie Verwoerd, who's a former South African ambassador and member of parliament in Nelson Mandela's administration. And here in Doha is Sami Hermez, Associate Professor at Northwestern University in Qatar. He specialises in social movements, the state and security in the Arab world. A warm welcome to you all. Sami, let's start with you. How significant is this UN General Assembly vote? It's highly unlikely to lead to a binding resolution in the Security Council anytime soon, is it? I mean, is it the best the UN can do? Of what relevance is this vote to someone suffering under the constant bombardment in Gaza?
No, I mean, on one hand, it's great that we've seen a shift of 20 countries in the last month, but of course, it's not quick enough. And of course, it's wonderful to see that the U.S. is now isolated. I think that's the first step. Is that it's isolated, and we hope that the next resolution that comes out will see a change, and the U.S. won't be able to protect, its interests and Israel anymore. But in a sense, it is also, as the Israeli ambassador to the UN said, right? It's total doublespeak. I mean, he blames the Palestinians for everything, but they're the ones who are constantly breaking international law. And so, in a way, the UN has become ineffectual. But I think what is really important is this movement. What you see is international global solidarity actually sort of moving this dial. And I think that's what's really important, is that we see that, even this resolution, it's not put on the table. And Antonio Guterres, he did not invoke Article 99 because Russia told him or China told him. This movement we're seeing is because of global public opinion and pressure on the streets, in the hallways of power, in all sorts of ways that it can talk about in this in the next minutes. But I think that is really where we should really take note, that none of this would happen if it wasn't for this public pressure.
Melanie, 10 nations voted against, including the US. The UK and Germany were among the 10 nations who abstained. How isolated does this vote leave the US? Picking up on from what Sami was saying, what message does it send? And is that message likely to be heeded? And if so, when?
Well, I mean, the message is very, very strong, right? It's not often that the UN votes on something so strongly and agree on something that strongly. So the message is very clear. The question is, what will it result in? The moral message is there. And I mean, also interesting for me, living in Africa, only 3 countries did not vote for it. 2 abstained, and it was only Liberia who voted against it. So, even in a continent as diverse as Africa, seems to be a very, very strong message. And one has to ask, how can there not be? How can one not ask for a ceasefire after everything that we've seen and that we've seen on our television screens now for so long? But the question is, of course, with the Biden administration, are they actually going to heed this message? And, well, one would think that he would increasingly start thinking about the fact that he is losing a lot of support also in America from the liberal left. But, it seems that this relationship with Israel just keeps on holding them in some way, both financially and also diplomatically, seems to consistently still support Israel in this war.
Temir, picking up on that, allies are supposed to speak supportively of allies, at least in public, and take a more honest and robust tone in private. What are we to make then of President Biden's remarks that Israel's indiscriminate bombing of Gaza is losing its public support, and that Prime Minister Netanyahu needs to change his government and his stance on a 2-state solution? Where is that coming from?
Well, I believe that President Biden is probably speaking about his own public opinion, because Israel's public opinion, Israel's support all over the world has never really existed on the Palestinian cause. I think the vote at the UN General Assembly resolution on Palestine reflects what the, I would say, historic opinion in the global South is about the conflict and the fate of the Palestinian people and the rights of the Palestinian people. It is in the West, in the United States, in the European Union, where governments have been supportive of Israel, somehow in disconnect with a growing portion of their own public opinions who are, of course, appalled at the barbaric campaign of bombing that has been imposed over Gaza, and of course, it is their own stance supporting Israel, despite of these, I would say, proofs that are visible to all public's opinion and to the world, that is creating an internal problem in Western societies and for Western governments, such as the U.S. government of President Joe Biden. And I think he's referring to that public opinion that doesn't understand how governments in the West are supportive of the government of Israel, irrespectively of its actions that are clearly violating international law and of course, committing war crimes.
Let's discuss the points that you bring up there with Sami. Sami, what are we to make of the stark differences in position on Israel and its bombing of Gaza of governments? I'm not talking about public opinion here now, but governments in the global south compared to those richer nations in the north.
Look, the whole issue really stems from the fact that Israel is ultimately a European settler colony. So it makes perfect sense that Europeans, so the richer countries, Europeans, Americans, are going to support their settlers. And so I think this is a really important point that keeps getting missed. And this is why there's a real interest from the US to support the Israeli state, because it supports its interests in the region. And I would go as far as to say that we talk about ethnic cleansing and genocide, but really I think what we see here is the US actively involved in this, and it's just Israeli soldiers doing the labor of it. But I think this is why you don't see global South countries supporting Israel. They're not, it isn't a global South settler colony. So I think this is. And I think one other thing I'd want to say on President Biden's remarks is that he's said things to this effect in the last month that things are public opinion is shifting and so on. I find these as sort of diversions. They're just ways to sort of buy time. I mean, you can keep saying this, but ultimately the U.S. can turn off the weapons supplies. It continues to do so even in light of these massive atrocities, and it could turn this off. And according to Israeli generals and former generals, they would tell you that it would end this war very quickly if that stops.
Melanie, is this shattering the reputation of nations who continue to stand by Israel, the war on Gaza, I mean, and what does this conflict mean for international law? Who, in future, polices nation-state actors when they appear to be able to act with impunity?
Well, let me just first say, in terms of what the previous speaker was saying, I think Sami is the name, of course, that South Africa would very much echo that on an official level, exactly that South Africa is very aware, and the ANC government in particular, how Israel had very close relationships with with the apartheid government for many years, and how many of the weapons that were actually used to kill anti-apartheid activists came either from Israel directly or through Israel. And so, then, of course, also that the ANC government can see how the Palestinian cause, the fight for freedom against land occupation, etc., very much mirrors their own battle for so many decades for freedom in South Africa. And Mandela, of course, famously said that South Africans wouldn't be free until the Palestinian people are also free. So I just wanted to echo that. In terms of international law, as an African and somebody from the Global South has always said and has always pointed out for a very long time, well, not always, but certainly for decades, the hypocrisy when it comes to international law and the application of international law, in particular when it comes to a superpower like America, who likes to play this sort of global policeman, and yet when the rules have to apply to them or to countries that they support, they often change the rules or somehow want to reinterpret the rules. And that's not something new for people in the global south. We are very aware of that. And so the question is not a new question. It is just whether this is finally the tipping point where the world will see that, to use the children's story, that the king actually has no clothes on when it comes to America in this moral global question.
Temir, is this a tipping point? To what extent is this a defining moment, not just for the UN, but the current world order and countries that claim to stand for defending human rights?
Well, yeah, it is a test. Definitely, it is a test, but it is reassuring to see that in the General Assembly of the United Nations, such a unanimous stance in defense of the rights of the Palestinian people in this particular case, but that also says a lot about the aspiration of the Global South and the international community at large to have an international, I would say, international realm that is organized around international law, so that every country has to abide to international law. And in this case, it is very clear that the behavior of Israel is, of course, opposed to those values. At the same time, in the United Nations, for instance, once one country like Israel behaves in such a manner, there should be, the recourse to the United Nations Security Council, where the members of the Security Council would be able to impose sanctions, international sanctions in this case, to the country that is violating international law. But we all know that the political logic and the geopolitical logic imposes itself because the United States would exercise its veto rights. So it's a moment where at the same time you see this very large aspiration, but also where you can show the limits of the current international architecture, that the tools are there, but there are also political tools for those countries who want to impose a unilateral vision or a unilateral force in the international realm. So it becomes very clear to the international public opinion what needs to be changed in this architecture for, once again, a more balanced and peaceful international arena to exist.
So, Temir, is the UN currently a complete waste of time, nothing but a debating theatre of wishes and dreams? I mean, its critics have been saying for a long time that it's not fit for purpose. Its credibility, and once again that of the Security Council, is on the line here right now, isn't it? I mean, if the UN can't stop the indiscriminate killing of innocents, it's as good as useless.
Well, I understand and share that frustration, but at the same time, it's the only tool available for small countries, those who cannot impose force. So, this is realpolitik, and indeed, in the face of realpolitik, the UN cannot do much. But at least it is a forum where that injustice can be underlined, and I think it's very important that the ability for the international community and the global South to express its opinion and to unveil the double standards and the injustices is in itself something that is worthy of keeping. But I understand, of course, the frustration that these tools do not allow the international community to stop the killing and the oppression over the Palestinian people.
Melanie, do you want to come in there and expand upon what Temir was saying?
Well, I mean, again, from South Africa, and I think more generally the Global South has for a very, very long time complained and pointed out that a body like, particularly the UN Security Council, is not representative of the whole globe, and neither does it serve the need and the interests of a very large section, 2/3 of the world's population. And so they have been critical about this for so long. but I do agree, and of course also like bodies of the ICC, and it is worthwhile mentioning that South Africa has asked quite a while ago already the International Criminal Court to issue a warrant of arrest for President Netanyahu for war crimes. And it's going to be, I think, from a southern perspective, it's going to be very interesting to see what the ICC will do. But I do agree that, at the moment we don't actually have something better than the UN yet to hold countries to account. Of course, on an economic level, this is why BRICS, you have seen such a big expansion and development around BRICS, where more than 40 countries wanted to be part of this. And 6 quite big countries were who entered BRICS this year and will start being full partners on the 1st of January. And that is all part of this effort of the Global South and also of Africa to form a balancing power or a balance against the sort of superpower of particularly America, who seems to often not act in the interest of the Global South.
Sami, after the General Assembly vote, Israel's envoy called the UN a moral stain on humanity. And as far as public global opinion is concerned, I mean, you could argue that he has a point, not for the reasons that he was actually arguing at the time, but many people are so frustrated with the UN's apparent impotence while people are dying every hour in Gaza.
Yes, I think, listening to your other 2 guests, the one thing that strikes me is that, and you've said this as well, is that this is not the first time we talk about the UN not meeting its responsibilities. But I think this is one of those moments where Global South countries could really take the charge. And, I think the ICC is a defunct institution, and I think Global South countries should be thinking about alternative institutions and just bypassing, the Western powers. But of course, that is in some ways dream talk. But I think
I was going to say, how Sami, how would that work?
Well, I mean, I think you have 150 nations that have agreed on something. They can actually take action and say, we're going to impose a no-fly zone on Israel and put that on the table as a threat, and let's see where that goes. I mean, I assume I imagine that things would probably eventually de-escalate from there rather than escalate into a global war. I don't think that that's where it would go, but the threat of something like that, or thinking about an alternative international criminal court to sort of put these things on the table, not allow Israeli politicians to travel around like as if they're not committed war crimes. I think some of these things are really important ways that we could put pressure to think about new institutions, because we get to this point every time. This is not the first time on Palestine that we've talked about the incapacity of the UN, but we find ourselves here every time. And it's tiring, and Palestinians are dying in the meantime. And when they're not dying in great numbers as they are in Gaza, they're dying of slow genocide, that you see, for example, in the West Bank, right, where their territory is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And so, but under the radar. Nobody cares. Nobody cared about the prisoners until October 7. And now, people are talking about Palestinian prisoners.
Temir, Sami's got a point, hasn't he? I mean, this talk of it being high time for new institutions is all well and good, but in the meantime, people are dying now.
Absolutely. But again, it is ultimately, if you will, because we move from the framework of, and we have shown the limits of international institutions and international law. But it's probably then to the public opinions in the countries that are supporting this horrendous policies. For instance, the public opinion in the United States should put pressure on its government. I mean, it's political action is always difficult. It requires building appropriate tools. Why aren't Western politicians put to the scrutiny by their own public opinions on the supporting of Israel. Why don't we have a broader or deeper discussion in the countries that are responsible ultimately for supporting Israel in this? This is probably the way. It is probably the national public opinions that need to do the work in order to change the policies of their own countries, which are backing and probably the very same people in Israel. Again, where is the public opinion in Israel, and is it supportive of this horrendous campaign? Again, I think this is the time again to focus on where things can be changed immediately in order to reach what we all hope for, which is a ceasefire and then a political resolution that takes into account the rights of the Palestinian people.
Melanie, final word to you then. Do you have any hope that could happen, that this can be brought to a conclusion quickly without further suffering and death?
Well, it's probably not that quickly, but certainly I never underestimate the strength of ordinary people on their governments if they start uniting. And I agree, this is now public opinion that has to really push, because even, for example, I think countries should turn their attention now to the US as well, not only to Israel, because we can see that it's not really working with Israel. But I think if countries like, for example, in the European Union, etc., starts putting pressure also on America, that could also help in more speedily bringing forth a peaceful resolution, which is so desperately needed for the people of Gaza.
Melanie, you really think that it's going to come ultimately down to people power?
Well, people pushing their political leaders to stop. The Israelis have made it clear they will not stop until they will, in their view, eradicated Hamas, which I think anybody who's grown up amongst liberation movements know that you cannot stop, in particularly terrorist organizations, by killing them. You have to take away the conditions that motivates them to exist. I think we know that it's not working on Israel, but I think public opinion needs to push the rest of the world to all stand together. And we've seen many of them have come together now, but the remaining ones, and in this case, particularly America, who funds a large extent this war, or to a large extent contributes to the funding of this war, and also, albeit then in public, still, supports the war. I think we need to, that is what's going to make the difference, is the pressure to stop this.
Okay. There, we must end our discussion. Many thanks indeed to you all. Sami Hermez, Melanie Verwoerd, and Temir Porras. And thanks to you for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can join the conversation on X, our handle at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again. Bye for now.